Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thanks, everyone, for joining me today. Today's episode is the backbone of compliance, which is management, people, and systems. I am excited to dive into this next topic. I would like to give a little bit about my background. I got my start in the cannabis industry in 2009, working in vertically integrated operations in Denver, Colorado. And in 2015, I founded my company, ICS Consulting, and I have been helping cannabis operators launch their operations and getting ready to get ready in this regulated market across the United States for the last 10 years. We're on episode 16, which is pretty incredible. 16 weeks in, and it's been a pretty amazing journey. I'm still learning and growing, and I really do appreciate everyone who tunes in and listens to an episode. I wanted to first start with the role of management in a regulated market. The first thing I wanted to dive in and tackle is why strong leadership and clear accountability matter. And from my own experience of working in cannabis operations and also helping operators, what I find is that when there's not strong leadership or any kind of systems in place and there's no accountability, everything begins to break down. And when you're in a regulated market, you're under the microscope, hence the name of my podcast is Under the Microscope. You're watched, everything is on camera, you're getting inspections, just like any other regulated industry that's out there. Strong leadership is really important. One thing that I've learned is that if you do not have strong leadership and there's no clear leader, it can be very confusing for all the employees that are under that person or that manager or that owner. And if there's not anyone that's been communicated on what role or what they're doing, it can really cause a lot of chaos in a business. Clear accountability, I think I've talked about this a couple times on a few different episodes, the importance of what everybody's job is, and I'm gonna jump into that a little bit later, but what everyone's job is and what role, what things they're supposed to do, and then how are we holding people accountable? And what happens when we don't hold people accountable? I see it time and time again in facilities where we'll have an employee handbook, we'll do training, and then everyone is following all the policies, and then one person isn't. What then begins to happen is if that person does not get pulled in and you're not having a conversation with them and you're not writing them up and giving them a warning, typical human resource processes, right? Verbal warning. If they do it again, then they get a written warning for those who've had any kind of human resources. What then happens is if it keeps going on and that person keeps getting away with things and keeps doing these things, all the other employees are seeing that. And then they begin to think, if they can do it, why can't I? And how come I have to follow the rules and this other person gets away with doing whatever they want? That really starts to build disdain, people wanting to blur the lines, push the boundaries. People begin to not care. They begin to think that you don't care because nobody's being held accountable. So, accountability, it is really important in any business, right? But you're in the regulated cannabis industry. So, an employee, let's say, who's not following the rules, who's not following your policies, wants to do whatever they want, they could essentially put your business at risk and you could get a fine or a violation. And so you do not want any kind of rogue behavior going on in your business. So, number two, you're managing the risk and not just people. It's important, yes, we have to manage people and how we hold everyone accountable and how we implement processes and train everyone. But how are we managing the risk? Managing the risk, there's other components. There's auditing all your systems, not only your management systems, but all of your processes, how you're handling money, how you're tracking inventory, financial audits, risk management relating to insurance, risk management around federal standards or OSHA, making sure all your SOPs are in place and getting updated and everyone's getting training. You're managing more than just people. And so it's really important to understand how your business is going to manage these risks. Building a culture of compliance from the top down. This is my favorite. I have been talking about building a culture of compliance for 10 years now, and it still is very relevant 10 years later. Building a culture of compliance, I want people to understand it's not like you wake up and you go into work and you say, okay, everyone, I'm going to build a culture of compliance today. That's not how it works. A culture of compliance is something that is inherent in following all the rules and regulations. I'll give some examples. If I am following all the rules and regulations in my cannabis operation, and just a reminder, legal cannabis operation can be dispensary, medical or adult use. It can be a cultivation facility. It can be a manufacturing facility. It can be a testing lab. It can also be transport and delivery company. It can be a consumption lounge. All the different areas where they license these different facilities for the medical and adult use market. You're building a culture of compliance. And how you do that is through following all the rules and regulations, all your processes, all your SOPs, your training. You're fully engaged to every aspect, every area, every functioning piece of that regulated business. And then when you do that and all that's happening, it inherently creates this culture of compliance. That's the culture. You're building this positive culture, just like any other culture that you wanna talk about out there, whether it's a culture of honesty, right? There's also a culture of safety, a positive workforce culture. How do you think all those things get to that? A culture of safety can only happen if you're fully engaged with worker safety in your cannabis operation. If you have all the tools, all the SOPs, all the training, all the certifications that you need to make sure that you provide a safe workplace, that inherently builds a culture of safety, just like a culture of honesty and talking about security and making sure there's no theft going on. An episode I did not that long ago, we talked about how employee theft is 80% in the cannabis operation. It's a shocking number. So 80%, that tells me something is severely going wrong in some of these cannabis operations if 80% of theft is from employees in a cannabis business. There's some type of breakdown happening, whether it's in compliance or systems that's happening, or if people are looking the other way and letting it happen, and there's no accountability, but there's something severely eroding in that business that has continuous theft. Yes, can theft happen? 100%. And then you address it and you fix it so it doesn't happen again and you make the correction and you change course. But if it's consistently happening, you've got a serious problem in that business and there's something completely eroding within that culture that people think they can just steal from you and they do not respect your business whatsoever. There was a book I read, I actually have it on my desk here. I wanted to talk about it and I'll bring this up before I jump into the rest of my notes here, but the name of the book is called The E Myth Revisited, and E stands for entrepreneur. And it says why most small businesses don't work and what to do about it. And the book is written by Michael E. Gerber. You can get this book on Amazon or wherever people buy books. I actually just recently re-listened to it after reading it 10 years ago when I started my business. I decided to listen to it on audio, and it was amazing to go back to it after being 10 years in business and say, "Oh, yeah, I did that. Oh, I learned that lesson. Oh, I'm going through that right now." Or when I read the book, I hadn't experienced it yet, and 10 years later, I did. I'll put the book up for those who might wanna check it out. If you're a small cannabis business operator, I highly suggest reading this book and really take heart to the things that he says. It's so helpful, and he talks about these breakdowns and why they happen and why small businesses are failing. Yeah, without your team and without these processes and without systems and a good structured management system, compliance is gonna be very challenging, and things like theft arise and or you have high turnover, or your customers aren't coming in anymore and you're losing customers. And when people come in, if you're public facing like a dispensary and people come in and your employees have bad attitudes, I cannot tell you how many places I will not back into because of how an employee treated me or greeted me. Or you could just tell there's no training, there's no care. Everyone has a bad attitude. And that is usually from the top down, is what I find after working in these operations for the last 16 years. So it's really important having leadership, clear accountability. When I say clear accountability, I just want to remind you just having a handbook is not enough. Having your employees sign a handbook, it's just not enough because they're going to forget. They're going to forget those 50 pages. It's something that you have to be engaged with them daily and have reminders up on the wall and have meetings and have conversations and have communication about. And it's not, here's the handbook, thanks for being here, and no one ever talks about it again. Strong leadership, clear accountability, managing the risk and not just people, and then building that culture of compliance. So I put together a list of 5 today. When I do my solo episodes, I like putting together some helpful lists. The list that I worked on today is 5 reasons effective management in a regulated cannabis operation can build a strong culture of compliance. Number 1, compliance needs to be integrated into every decision in the business. That totally makes sense. I have to say, it's not always the case. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes decisions get made based on money, and sometimes compliance is not even thought about in that decision. Maybe there's a decision or a choice being made around an employee or hiring somebody, changing packaging or making a big financial decision or expanding your brand. All those decisions, compliance should be at the forefront of that discussion. Bringing it back to management, let's just define this really quickly. Management could be your staff, your manager, right? The management team sometimes is kind of ownership. We usually define ownership as the executive level, depending on the size of your business. Larger companies, yes, they do have the executive level, the CEO, COO. Sometimes the mom and pop shops, they don't have it defined like an org chart. I believe every business, no matter the size, should have an org chart. So if you have 2 people in your business, you should have an org chart. I'll be diving into that later when we get into accountability and why that's so important. Management can be ownership, just to be clear, depending on the size of the business, how they have an org chart set up. They need to integrate the state, local, and federal rules and regulations into their everyday daily duties and job and decision making, they should understand that every choice that you make in your business can trigger a compliance risk for that cannabis operation. Every choice that a manager makes, every choice that a bud tender makes, every choice that trimmer makes or a grower, the person spraying the nutrients, the person suiting up and applying chemicals to your cultivation facility. For example, what if they're not certified and they have not taken worker protection standard training and they don't have an applicator's license, depending on what state you're in and your Department of Agriculture rules in your state. But let's just say, so I can make my point here, for example, you're in Colorado where you have to have an applicator's license to spray chemicals on a crop, and you have to document with all that paperwork, and there's just letting whoever spray in that grow thinking, how often is the Colorado Department of Agriculture going to come in my facility? They only come in once a year. They're never going to know. Maybe they're coming in every 2 months. Or maybe you're not getting inspected as much in your state. But at the end of the day, that decision and that choice has compliance integrated into it. And the minute that you decide to let an employee spray an application of chemicals on those plants and not have an applicator's license, you just created a compliance risk for the safety of that employee because they don't have the proper training and who knows how they're handling their PPE gear and the mask and the REI for when they're able to return into the room. A lot of REIs are 4 hours or more when you spray chemicals in a room to when somebody can come in. What if they're wearing the wrong mask and now they're inhaling chemicals or they're getting chemicals on their skin? And these decisions, they matter. That's a compliance risk because you're not following labels. And in most cases, in regulated cannabis operations, especially when we start getting into cultivation and manufacturing and chemicals and federal standards and EPA and OSHA and all these things, you have to read the labels. You can't just do whatever you want with chemicals. You have to respect the labels, the PPE requirements, and also understand the safety data sheets and what happens if you do get a chemical on your skin or in your eyes. You're not just going to throw water on your face. What if water makes the chemical react more badly? What if you're supposed to do something else? So that's why it's really important to have compliance integrated into every decision that you make and every employee and every decision that they make. And then the people responsible for managing those employees, ensuring that they're making those good decisions. Another reason, in 5 reasons, effective management in a regulated cannabis operation can build a strong culture of compliance. Accountability and documentation are the standard. I think I hear some applause out there from all my compliance nerds and fellow worker safety and compliance people. Accountability and documentation are the standard. Sometimes this can be a very weak area for people. They might have the documentation or they might meet the minimum record keeping requirements that the state sets forth for a cannabis operation, but sometimes they're lacking the documentation required at a federal level. So I'm talking worker safety, EPA, OSHA, worker protection standards, applying chemical, like I talked about, the applicator's license. These are things that people forget about in cannabis operations. It's tunnel vision sometimes that, oh, okay, my local municipality tells me can only do this, and the state tells me I can only do that, and that's what I'm focused on. And what I find is that sometimes these states, like New York, Missouri, they'll have QMS, quality management systems. They're starting to pull some of these federal standards into the cannabis regulations, which I am very happy about. But when they don't pull some of these federal standards into the rules and regulations for cannabis, sometimes it's out of sight, out of mind. Sometimes people don't even have the context. If you have never worked in a regulated industry and you didn't come from pharmaceutical or maybe that food manufacturing or co-packing or the manufacturing world or construction or oil and gas, because we know OSHA's very big in those areas, you might not be even aware that you need to be following OSHA or that there's food safety regulations when it comes to your manufacturing facility. And it really depends on what your state has set up for you. And it's important for an operator to do all the research they can or to try to get as much context as you can to make sure that you have all the documentation that you required and that it really is a standard, that it's a high standard in your business. So effective management builds strong chains of responsibility and it assigns ownership and it implements accountability. That is so true. My goodness, that is true. Like strong chains of responsibility. I think that's really important to highlight. Without the strong chains of responsibility and assigning ownership to employees, you won't be able to have accountability. No one's going to take responsibility. It's just going to be a smorgasbord of blended policies, people making up whatever they want. Sometimes ownership is not on the same page if you have multiple owners operating these cannabis operations. They will not follow the policies and they'll come in and just make up one on the fly, while we have another owner who's fully engaged with the policies that were created in the business. And that can be very confusing and damaging for workforce culture. I think with employees, they just need to know, what is it that I'm responsible for? What do I need to be doing? How am I going to be held accountable? And that's what they want to focus on. And let me have the structure and systems in place so I can thrive. But when you're lacking all those things, it's a very unhealthy culture. Employees are very unhappy in that situation. It's very confusing and chaotic, and it doesn't help anyone. Another piece, it's so important to have accountability in your business. I mentioned that book about the E Myth Revisited. In that book, he talks about the importance of having an org chart. If you have two or more in your business, you should have an org chart. So we'll just say that we have two owners and then 10 employees. You can have an org chart and say, oh, here's the COO, here's the CEO, here's the CFO, here's our store manager, or here's our head grower, or here's our metric compliance person. You can have a chart, but then have a separate page where you have that title, the CFO. Here are all the things the CFO is responsible for. Here are all the things the COO is responsible within the operation. Here are all the things that the manager is responsible for. So every job in the business is assigned to somebody. How money gets spent, how money is allotted, who's paying the bills, who's doing the taxes. Are you paying taxes every month? Are you doing it quarterly? Do you have a bookkeeper? Do you have a CPA? Who's communicating? Who's the main contact for communicating with that CPA? Who's getting all the information over to the CPA? That's more ownership stuff, but who's communicating changes to the manager? For example, if you guys decide We want to grow 10 more strains in our cultivation facility. And we're going to now take those 10 strains and they're just going to be used for joints. And we want to make like whole bud joints, right? We don't want to there's all kinds of ways to make joints. Some of them are ground up with the trim, but we're going to take whole bud and we're going to lightly grind it. So it's like a chunky bud joint. Who's communicating all that? Who's communicating? Whose job is it to talk about how are we going to test this? What are the papers or the cones that we're going to use? How are we going to package it? What about our labeling? Making sure that we're in compliance. Do we have the personnel to then expand into making these joints? Do we have the room in our facility to grow these 10 more strains? How much room are these 10 strains of these plants going to take up in a room? Do we have enough tables? Do we have enough lights? Do we have enough money of the cost of those lights? Do we have enough money to pay for the testing to get that product to the customer? What's it going to cost for us to brand that to the customer? What are all the compliance components involved in that decision? And then in all those things I just talked about, let's just make a number up, but let's just say there's 50 jobs associated, not like jobs like employment jobs, but there's 50 tasks that have to be completed within that system. Who's responsible for that task? And has it been communicated? Who's holding everyone accountable that they get all the tasks completed? Essentially, like a project manager who's managing all the tasks. What are the timelines? What are the deadlines? Are there any regulatory hurdles? Do we need to talk to the attorney? Do we need to have our compliance consultant come in and help us? What are all the things that are involved? Like in budgeting, I learned this a long time ago when I started learning to budget finances for my business, is that every penny has a job. Every penny has a job. The same is for your cannabis operation. Every task, every job in your cannabis operation has to have somebody associated with it. Everything, every little thing from how money's being handled, who's counting the money, who's sweeping, who's mopping, who's taking out the garbage, who's making sure the cameras are working, who's making sure all the SOPs are getting updated, who's doing all the training. Every job, every element in the business has to have a person attached to it to make sure it's getting completed. And that's why accountability and documentation are the standard. Because without those things, without engagement, without those things happening, you are in deep doo-doo. Really, you're in deep doo-doo in your business. Pardon my French. You're creating a compliance risk in your business. So it's really important to have that. Number 3, people first leadership and developing a culture of compliance. If your people are happy, guess what? Your customers are happy. Your product is great. I know I mentioned that book, The E-Myth Revisited. One of the things that he says in that book, which I think is so true, if you are sloppy in your business, you will have a sloppy business. If you are chaotic in your business, you will have a chaotic business. If you are not responsible in your business, you will have a not responsible business. It's so true. You are how you act. You are your actions or inaction. It's so black and white. So if you're looking at your business and these things are happening, there's someone in the business that is either their action or inaction. And by the way, not taking action and not doing anything is an action. You're choosing to do nothing. That's still a choice. When you choose to do nothing and choose to not take action and you choose to be sloppy, you're not just sloppy. Sloppy just doesn't happen. Being sloppy is a choice. Just like you wake up and you brush your teeth and you brush your hair. If you don't brush your teeth and you don't comb your hair and you don't put clean clothes on and you don't clean up after yourself, that's a choice. That's a choice to be sloppy. It's a choice to not be engaged in documentation, to not have the right SOPs. That's a choice. That's what he's saying in his book is you are how you act, or the lack of not doing anything. You are that too. That is your choice. So if your business is failing, there is a choice that you are making in your business that is causing you to fail. And I would never say that unless I know that for myself as somebody who has had a business for 10 years. I have to constantly look at the choices I make, and I make mistakes all the time, and I have to correct and adapt and pivot all the time and take responsibility. So developing that culture of compliance, that's true leadership. If you have strong leadership, oh my gosh, your employees, they're going to notice that. They're going to see that. They're going to see that great culture and that strong leadership and that you cared and that people first leadership. It's so important to have that because that feeds into the culture of compliance. It's hard to imagine, but caring and putting your employees first promotes healthy compliance in your cannabis operation. Because then your employees are gonna care, they're gonna wanna do their job. Every job has been assigned to a person in the business. There's strong communication. So, strong leadership from the executive team to the management team and staying true to enforcing the company policies, it fosters accountability and it fosters compliance. Number 4, and 5 reasons effective management in a regulated cannabis operation can build a strong culture of compliance. Adaptability without chaos. The cannabis industry changes nonstop and it'll either keep you on your toes or knock you on your butt. Either you're on your toes or you're knocked flat on your butt. I always talk about this in every solo episode that I do. The cannabis industry is full of curveballs, and it is the up and down, making a little for those listening. I just drew some mountain peaks that are going up to the sky, and those peaks have valleys. There's the top of the mountain where everything is going wonderful. I love this. This is amazing. I'm so happy I'm in the cannabis industry. I love my job. I feel good about myself. I can totally do this. This is my thing. And then when we get into the valley, it's, "Oh, man, this sucks. I suck. Like, this is really hard. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. I wanna give up in this place." This is something I face in my own business. I have my own valleys, and I have my own mountain peaks and my ups and downs of working in the cannabis industry. It's always changing. There's always something coming up. There's always something that you need to face in your business. And so adaptability without chaos, if you're sloppy in your business is sloppy. Like if you're chaotic and your business is chaotic. So you can eliminate the chaos with having systems in place. And structure is your friend, and it's actually your most important friend in running a regulated business. Having structure, like I said, all those jobs need to be assigned to something. All those jobs need to be defined and have structure. When do they get implemented? How do they get implemented? What are their steps? Who's doing what and when? How do I do it? The structure is that. When you have structure and you're engaged in that structure and you have all the systems in place and you're following those systems, when a curveball happens, guess what? You just adapt. You can adapt. There's no chaos because you're organized. You have all these systems in place. Everyone's engaged. You have leadership. There's communication in the business. Everyone's following the structure that was implemented. It's not a bunch of SOPs collecting dust on a bookshelf, or nowadays everything is in the cloud. It's not in a folder in your cloud sitting there that no one's opened in 6 months and looked at. It's every quarter we review our SOPs and sit down and talk about it and make sure there's nothing that needs to be updated or changed and that we're in compliance, and then we communicated all those changes. Here's a good example. In Colorado, every August, rulemaking session starts. So for the whole year, there's work groups and there's bills going through the House and the Senate in Colorado. There's a legislative session. People come in and they sponsor these bills where they're trying to streamline cannabis regulations right now. That's what they're doing in Colorado. We've been overregulated for a long time. Where at one point we used to have 900 pages of regulations. I think we're now down to 500 or 600. But they're going through all these and going, okay, but this is redundant. This is too much. We already have this in 10 other places. What are some things that we can do to ease the financial burden on some of these operators? And they're going in and they're fixing all these things. And then once it goes through legislative session and it passes, and then what happens is then we get to the implementation phase of it. And then it shows up in rulemaking session, which is beginning here in Colorado in August. If you don't attend those meetings in your state, and let's say you don't attend any of the rulemaking sessions that are open to the public, they're on Zoom, they record them, and then they send them out or they post them on their YouTube channel or their website. They record them and then you can go listen. You should be paying attention to that. So let's just say we get to the implementation day. Let's just say it's January 1st, 2026, and a rule change happened and you didn't know because you didn't read the rules, you didn't go to the meetings, you didn't pay attention to the emails, you don't have anyone on your team supporting you for compliance, and then a regulator came in and gave you a violation for it. You're panicking and you're running around with your head cut off, and instead of being proactive, you're being reactive. Being reactive is chaos. And a lot of people react to compliance in the cannabis industry. If you are proactive, adapting is not hard. And you can adapt without causing disruption to your business, not disrupting compliance, not disrupting the morale, not disrupting the operations, and making it a smooth transition. Sometimes it really is the lack of preparing and the lack of staying on top of things and keeping up and not going to those meetings and not paying attention and not knowing what's going on can really cause a lot of chaos in a business. So you can have adaptability without chaos. And one thing I want to bring up too, that regulators, they're not keen at all on people that have good intentions. At some point in your state, good intentions are going to get you nowhere anymore. Good intentions will lead to a violation. If I'm driving down the road and I'm speeding, but I had a good intention of being a good driver and I follow the driving structure every day, but I was panicking or I felt unsafe or something happened that I sped up, I wasn't paying attention, I didn't see the speed limit sign, and a police officer pulls me over, and I say, "Officer had every good intention to be a good driver," they're gonna laugh at me and give me a ticket. They really are, they're gonna laugh at me and give me a ticket. The same for the regulators. It's their job to enforce the rules and regulations. And so regulators appreciate people who take action and that are proactive versus reactive. So, number 5, and 5 reasons effective management in a regulated cannabis operation can create and build a strong culture of compliance. Communication, it flows up, it flows down, it flows across, it goes sideways, however way. Boy, oh boy, communication's a tough one. It could be almost 75% of issues that people have in their business is because of lack of communication. And I'm not an expert, and maybe that number's higher, but I really do think communication is such an issue for people. And then once again, that's that job I talked about, assigning every job to every person in your business who's ensuring that there's communication from the top all the way down to every morsel in your company. So, strong management is the bridge between ownership, all your compliance team, your compliance officers, and all your frontline staff, which is basically bud tenders, packagers, the last person to touch that product, whether it's in the manufacturing facility, the last person to touch that product before it goes off the testing, the last person to touch that product before it goes out the door to the customer. That's the front line in the cannabis industry, the front line of protecting consumer and public safety. So without communication, compliance suffers and the business will ultimately fail. It's really important to have some type of process and structure around communication. If you're not good at it, if it's a weakness, it's totally fine. Then you hire somebody to help you. If you're going to work in the regulated cannabis industry, communication should be in your top 5. I have to do these 5 things in order to be successful. Communication has to be on that top 5 list. Another area I want to talk about is that your people are not just laborers. As somebody who was an employee almost my entire life until I owned a business 10 years ago, I have been part of the workforce for over 30 years in the United States, doing everything. I spent 23 years in restaurants, hotels, catering, working in bed and breakfasts, like commercial kitchens, everything you can imagine in hospitality, bartended. I've done it. So your people are not just labor, they are the gatekeepers of compliance. We are in the regulated cannabis industry. Your employees are gatekeepers. Their hands are the last thing that touches that package or that sale or quality assurance and making sure that we're putting out quality product and we have standards and SOPs are being followed. The employees in the cannabis industry, they're the gears. They're the gears that keep this industry going. If you don't put oil in the gears, they're going to rust and the gears aren't going to work anymore. So essentially, you have to oil your workforce. I know these are funny analogies, but I always try to come up with a creative way of explaining why employees are important and why all these processes are important. You want to train your staff to make good decisions and not just follow the rules. It's important that employees know why. Why am I doing this? You gave me this SOP. You said I have to do this. Why? How does it affect the dispensary? How does it affect the grow? So I can understand the levity of it, the weight of the compliance risk. You want to create feedback between the front line and leadership. There has to be an open channel of communication. I, as an employee, need to feel that it's okay to come to management without fear of retaliation. When it comes to OSHA and worker safety, you cannot retaliate against the workforce wanting a safe work environment. It should be the same for everything in the business. Employees should feel safe enough that they can come up and ask a question, or there's communication between all different management levels, all the way up from the top to the bottom, through every category, however you're defining your roles and your org chart and your systems and who does what. Connecting the dots, how are these things getting communicated? The building systems for business growth is how important it is to not have undocumented workflows. You have to have mandated processes, standards in place where everyone is doing the same thing. If something is not working in that business, okay, make a suggestion, go to management, have a team meeting. If you're going to change something, change it, and then everyone on the team is getting trained on that. Everyone. And that way, it's not just a bunch of like random workflows. Workflows save money and time, and it creates an efficient environment, and it helps with quality control. And it is a huge component of compliance. One area that most cannabis operators overlook, and that's every single job in the business and who is responsible for every single one of those jobs from the top to the bottom. So that's probably like the number one piece that I don't see fully ironed out with a new cannabis operation. Typically, what's happened is that everyone's very focused on getting open and they have all these things in place. And then they think, oh, we can course correct as we go. But what happens if you get slammed? What happens if you're just slammed out of the gate and you don't have enough staff? A lot of times you can feel like you can't even catch your breath, that you can't even course correct or fix these things. And weeks and weeks go by and the issues just fester. So it's just really important to try to get every job defined, every role defined in your business. In wrapping up, talking about people, management, and systems as it relates to compliance. And it's really important to have these strong systems in place that support people, support your employees, that are supporting your managers so they can do an effective job. And this is something I will say probably for the rest of my life is that you have to have the right managers in place. You can't just have a manager who doesn't know how to be a manager and think it's going to work. You can have all the strong systems in the world, but if you did not train that manager on how to be a manager, they could basically fail. And so you have to have the systems, the people, and you have to then take those people and make sure you're putting them in the right position. And then you have to lift them up by having the proper support in place for them to do their job appropriately. And you want to have systems and structure and all these things in place that really will set everyone up in your business for success. And I'm telling you, if you have the right systems in place, you communicate and train people properly, they'll be able to execute everything effectively. Also, you want to avoid burnout. Burnout is a real thing in the cannabis industry, like any other industry. I know attorneys that get burned out in corporate law and doing litigation. Burnout, not just in cannabis, it happens everywhere. But if you are not familiar with why burnout happens in the cannabis industry, please check out a good video that I talk about basically why people get burned out in the cannabis industry. So you definitely want to avoid having burnout and you want to work smarter. We always say this in the restaurant industry, work smarter, not harder. I think that's true for everywhere. One mistake that I see operators make when it comes to managing people or processes, for me personally, I think it's the lack of processes that contribute to that, and the lack of having management trained properly or not having a leader in a leadership role. I think that can really hurt a business, and I think that can really affect compliance and morale. When I was managing dispensaries, I had a mentor that referred a pretty amazing book for me to read. I read this book about 16 years ago, and it's called The One Minute Manager, and it's by Ken Blanchard, and it's a situational approach to leading others. And here's what I learned when I got into the cannabis industry. I wasn't a good manager. That's what I learned. I'll be honest. I wasn't a good manager. I didn't have the right training. And finally, I had a mentor that said, "Hey, do you know how to manage?" And I'm like, "Isn't it just coming in and bossing people around?" No, it's not. I learned that right away. I learned that hard lesson as a manager in the cannabis industry, and I had people that didn't like me because of my approach. And so I read this book, The One Minute Manager, and it changed my life as a manager. It made me a better person. I became a better manager. I learned what it meant to be a leader. And then when I started my business, I learned how to be a leader for myself and in my business. I just want to put that out there for everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. If you're interested in streaming this episode, it will be available on Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and also Pandora Radio. For those who like to watch, please go ahead and go onto my YouTube channel and subscribe. It is at Under the Microscope with Jenny. And thanks everyone for joining me today.